Alright, kind of a different video today, just looking at some stats. I've collected a bunch and thought I'd share. Firstly, starting with closed. So the stats you're seeing are all closed. The bottom half of the screen, totally ignore because that's stuff I intended to fill out and never got to. Um, but the first part where it says turn advantage, I collected 342 games. First turn won 155 closed games. These were all closed trade games I used as my sample. I thought closed trade would be a good way to define these are good closed players playing, and I wanted to find the win percentage, and I wanted some specific way to check. This is also all rules are in effect, except elemental. So this is not going to cover, is it different without the wall rules, or if you take away plus what happens, or without combo. This is assuming kind of a standard high level rule set with same plus, same wall, plus wall, and combo and random. These are all random games. First turn won 155, 109 ties, 78 losses. Interestingly, after the first 100 games I looked at, it was exactly 50 wins, 25 ties, and 25 losses, which made for fun win percentage because it was really easy to calculate the win percentage. First turn wins half the games, and half the games are and the other half of games are split evenly between ties and second turn wins. Now, as it turns out, with a bigger sample, those numbers moved a bit. But as you can see, first turn still basically has double the wins of second turn. 156 would be exactly double, but this is, well within a margin of error. Obviously, it's basically double. And then ties are a touch under a third of the games. Somewhere between a third and a quarter of the games are tied. And then of the decisive games, first turn wins about twice as much as second. If we thus exclude ties, we have basically 66.67%, basically double the number of wins for first turn as for second. If we include ties as half of a win for first turn, half of a win for second turn, then first turn scores about 61%. For comparison, home team advantage in sports is usually around 60%. I think it's somewhere around there in both basketball and baseball, though I could be mistaken. But I tend to think of home court advantage, maybe because I focus on basketball, as about, if you know nothing else about the game except who the home team is, they're about 60% favorite. Now, of course, this is true in sports where basically either there aren't ties because overtimes decide it, or games like American football where ties are very rare. So that number is probably more comparable to the no tie percentage. So this could be seen as a even more significant advantage than home court in various sports, or home field advantage in sports. Including ties, it looks more on par. So maybe it's comparable to home field advantage in soccer, or as non-Americans would call it, football. Not sure exactly, but it clearly a very large advantage. Now, I also played 100 games. Just me playing, just seeing how I did. And I noticed for me personally, on first turn, I won 26, 13 ties, 10 losses. On second turn, I won 20 with 21 ties and 10 losses. Which is to say, I had a similar number of first turns and second turns, and my loss rate on both first turn and second turn was pretty similar. It was basically the same. But a bunch of my wins on first turn, I had 26 to 13, turned into ties on second turn. I had 6 fewer wins and 8 more ties. And so basically it was just wins turned into ties. But I think I'm probably a pretty good second turn player overall, and maybe not as good a first turn player. Also, I was really focusing on closed when I did this, and I think this is much better than I would perform now. It's a really good win percentage overall, and I would not maintain that if I tried this again, I suspect, or it would take some work to get back into that form. Not that this is some untouchable percentage, other people can certainly attain higher, but this was, I think, pretty good for me in closed. So anyways, overall, closed first turn is a huge advantage and wins about twice as much as second turn. So if you're thinking of this in terms of playing kind of trade or something, in trade, ties are neutral. If you had all first turns and your opponent had all second turns, you would expect to win about twice the number of cards they win over time. So that's a pretty huge advantage, to be honest. Now we're going to switch over to open data. And in open, I have collected 508 games of open. This is assuming, again, random, and assuming basically all rules in effect. except elemental. I think I included some games by mistake where maybe the wall rules were off or something, but it should be a very small number of the games. I do think stuff changes with wall rules missing, strategy changes. I would expect this to look different, but we're going to look at more in-depth stats. Over those games, first turn won 167, 200 ties, 141 second turn wins. So we can see the tie rate is significantly higher in open than closed. In closed, we saw a tie rate of around 32%. In open, it's 39%. Again, you may consider, 300 to 500 games not a big enough sample, but the numbers have moved around a lot less after I got to around 200 games of each. So I think this is a pretty good sample. The second turn win rate is up to 27.5%, while in closed it was only 22.8%. So despite closed having more decisive results, a lot of those results are because first turn is winning more. Second turn, even though there's more wins overall, second turn is getting less of them in the closed games. And the big difference is in open, first turn's winning 33%, and in closed, first turn is winning 45%. So a much bigger advantage, and this overall leads to, if we ignore ties, it's about 54% for first turn, and if we include ties, it's about 52.5%. For the first few hundred games, it was looking more like 54 and 58% were the advantages for first turn. So I'm sort of feeling like it's going to bounce back up again. But this is the range that makes it look like white in chess. White is an opening advantage worth around 53-54%. Much smaller than home court advantage in most sports, but still a very real and significant advantage. I also over here have about 43% of games someone attains a winning position, and they convert that position around 72%. So if someone is winning at some point in the game, they win about 72% of the time, and someone is winning, or each player is winning in a game. Each player has around a 43% chance on average of attaining a winning position at some point. And this basically adds up, right? So if I have a 43% chance of creating a winning position and I convert 72% of the time, that's a little under 3/4 of that. So that's going to be around 31% of the time I'm getting a winning game. And if you look here, the win rate, if we average 33 and 28, is around 30.5. It comes out pretty similar. Not super important. What I do want to get into is more specific stats that I kept for open. So corner starters were chosen in 107 plus 128 plus 77. Let's get the total. So 1 sec, equals sum of these numbers. So in those games, we had 312 corner starters, 108 side starters, and 47 center starters, which means we got corners about 2/3 of the time, almost exactly 2/3. We got side starters around 2/9, and center starters around 1/9. So that makes corners about 3 times as popular as sides, which are around twice as popular as center starters. Not exactly, but around there. And corner starters performed overall the best. Now, there's some Nash equilibrium stuff. So there's lots of stuff where the optimal thing to do is when all outcomes are equivalent. And I did not say that in a way that makes sense. And I don't have an example coming to mind. But say you're playing, some RPG, right? And you have an elemental system where water beats fire. Okay, let's do the generic Pokemon one. Grass beats water and fire beats grass. And then we insert something new. Let's insert rock. Rock loses to both water and grass, but beats fire really badly. And you're choosing, you can only have one Pokemon or one type to run, and you have to pick which one. And now grass and water are really appealing because there are 4 types, and water beats fire and rock, and grass beats water and rock. So everyone starts moving to grass and water because they beat the most types and the others lose to more types. And they realize, oh, grass beats water. So if everyone's using grass and water, we should all switch to grass. And as soon as that happens, people start picking fire up again, right? Because suddenly everyone's on grass, so now fire is great. And as soon as fire is popular, water and maybe even rock come back. And eventually you reach a kind of equilibrium state where, and okay, not everything necessarily reaches an equilibrium, and I might have come up with an example where it just rotates and the equilibrium is never met. But often what happens is a certain percentage of each starts being played where it all balances out, right? So if 50% of people do grass and 50% do water, the people who do water score terribly, so they start moving to other things. And if they say move to fire, you could eventually reach a point where there's enough fire, enough grass, enough water, maybe even 33% of each, where it's all balanced, right? And they're all scoring equally. And so I sort of think that's something that might conceivably happen here, where corner starters are the most popular, but if they're scoring below the others, they should get less popular and the others should grow in popularity. If corner starters are scoring higher than the other starters, then maybe they should be played even more often until all starter types are at the same rate. Something like that. I'm saying this really poorly, I apologize. It's late. I could just re-record this later when my brain's working better, but I'd rather just plow through and see if we say anything that makes sense to anyone. But I guess the point is, like, let's say you look and you're like, I have an okay corner starter, an okay side starter, and no center starter. And you're deciding between the corner and the side starter. And say you do that a bunch, and you notice over time the side starter that you think is okay is scoring worse than the corner starter that you think is okay. Which means corner starters you think are okay are actually better than okay side starters. So you start playing more corner starters, and suddenly you start accepting corner starters that are a little worse than okay. And maybe now those start scoring the same as the side starters, and your distribution starts looking more equivalent. That's usually going to be the correct ratio to go on when you're scoring equally with all moves. And that might turn out that, say you score, 60% with corners, 60% with sides, and there are just no center starters you could play where you would score high enough that you should ever play a center starter. It could turn out that you should never play one type of starter. It seems unlikely to me, but it is very possible. And in fact, if you look at the Delial randoms I've seen, I have not gotten a single random where he started with a center starter. I also don't think I've started with a center starter in the return of the site. And it might be that, center starters are not correct to play, though it also could be they're quite viable and people just haven't found the right strategies. And I think this gets to somewhere where the numbers can be misleading, because a lot of people playing center starters are not doing so because they like their starter. They're doing so because they can't find any other starter and their bailout is a center starter. And then of course center starters have low percentages, but if they had played a corner or side starter, it would probably have a low percentage too, because all the corner and side starters they found they thought were terrible. And so you sometimes see this effect where, because a move is a bailout type of move, it scores really low, but it is not actually as bad as it looks, because in the situations where it happens, anything would be really bad. And you could see this in basketball, of like shots at the end of a shot clock score a really low percentage, but that's because, or like desperation heaves are of course going to be a low percentage with the clock running out, but it's better to take a shot than not take the shot at all, right? Anything in that situation is going to be very low value, because if time runs out, you just lose the ball. I'm doing really bad on analogies. I'm sorry. This is probably just a mess of a video, but okay, let's stick with it. So as is, corner starters are winning about 34%, sides are winning 31.5%, and centers are winning 25.5%. Corners also have the lowest loss rate at 24.7%, sides at 35.2%, centers at 42.5%, leading to an overall win rate if we include ties, and I tend to care more about the win rate with ties, but you can see the win rates without ties over here. With ties, corner starters are scoring about 55%, sides have hovered close to 50% but are currently a little below at 48%, and center starters are slumming at 41.5, though they were actually even lower. They've been on an uptick recently. So that's the overall distribution of starters. But I think it is interesting to note that corner starters are not only scoring the best, they are also the most played, suggesting they should be played even more than how much they're being played right now. And I do think if you look at some of the players that are really good, the Dullials of the world, he plays corner starters at a higher rate than this. On the other hand, Akiyama, Turds, I'm sure I'm forgetting some people, Chickeny, I think play corner starters at a clearly lower rate than this, and either like side or center starters more than this suggests. So there's certainly cases for different starter types, but the people, I think corners should be played more than 2/3 of the time. And I think if you're playing corners less than 2/3 of the time, you probably should either have a reason you think your other starters are especially good. Either you've noticed something you don't think other people have noticed, or you have some kind of specific strategy with it that you think is beyond what other people are doing, or you're probably playing non-corner starters too much. Maybe your style doesn't fit corner starters. There's lots of reasons to move off them, but looking at the data, it's hard for me to not conclude corner starters are the best starter type overall, and that doesn't mean they should be played anywhere near 100% of the time, but even being played 2/3 of the time, they're still scoring the highest score by a pretty clear margin, and that suggests to me that maybe the correct percentage for corner starters is 3/4 or something like that. I then have the breakdowns of different replies to corner starters and different starter types. So the easiest to look at is replies to center starters over here. Replying with a side. The side has won more games. So here, losses here. The wins and losses are from the perspective of replying to a center starter. So a win here means second turn won, a loss here means first turn won. We've switched viewpoints. The percentages here are from second turn's perspective. So both types of replies to a center starter, both corners and sides, have more wins than they do losses. But this is a very small sample, it's about 20 games of each, a little over 20 games. So far, corner replies have scored better than side replies, but both have been above 50%, and both look like very strong replies to center starters. My personal bias is towards corners, but I also think my very best replies have been sides, and I think both are going to be tempting options, and both have a good chance to score well. If we then move on to replies to side starters, we see something quite interesting, which is playing next to them, in the corner next to the side played, has scored very well, scored clearly over 50%. Replying in a more distant corner has also scored over 50%, not by as much, but again, these are pretty small samples. But in general, meeting a side with a corner, be it next to or far away, has been the best way to meet it. Far sides, very small sample. With a bigger sample, it might be more telling. Center replies have scored a little under 50%, which on second turn is reasonable. Same with adjacent sides. These numbers are small samples, and they're fine. It's hard to tell. But it does look to me like replying in a corner is on average the best way to go. Again, doesn't mean we should do it every time, but it looks like it can be played a lot, and it will score well. And so in general, probably the first thing you should look at when you see a side starter is if you can play in a corner, because those seem to score well and be able to score well over large samples. And by large samples, I don't necessarily mean we've seen a lot of games with them. The game counts aren't that large, but it is to say they have been played more often, and despite being played more often, they've been able to score better. And think of it, I'm going to do another sports analogy. We're all about sports analogies that I've failed to pull off so far, but I think I can get this one to work. Let's say you take one shot per game in basketball, and that shot is an open layup. You sneak under the basket once a game, you get an open layup. Easy shot, you probably score. Now you're told you have to take 2 shots per game. Now, if you got open under the basket twice per game, that would be easy. But the defense is good, you only manage to sneak there about once a game. So your second shot, you're going to have to take a harder shot. And as we add shots to the number you have to take, you're probably not getting into advantageous positions, 100 times a game. You're getting into fantastic positions once a game. You're getting into a pretty good position a couple times a game. You're getting into an okay position a lot more than that. And anytime you want it, you can take a terrible shot because the defense will always give that to you. So as you add shots, your shots are on average likely to be getting worse. Occasionally this isn't borne out, but in general, the more shots you take, the more you will be adding weaker shots, and the more you will be diluting those free, easy shots that you were going to take no matter what. And I see a similar thing here, which is if something is being played a lot and is still scoring well, that probably means it is always available and does score well, or very often available. And I think this suggests that against side starters, corners are a good way to go. And going next to or going in a far corner, both viable. This suggests, a clear preference for next to, but both look like they're scoring really nicely. On the other hand, the other replies aren't really scoring badly at all. These are very small counts, and they're all one game away from being even, from having as many wins as losses. So maybe all are viable, but them being played so much less suggests to me maybe moves there aren't as often available. It might just be that no one looks there and you can find a big edge by finding it. I really like adjacent sides against side starters. I have not played any yet in the return, but I certainly look for them and think they're really appealing. And maybe there's some edge to be found in doing something unusual, but this does suggest what the standard and effective game plan should be. Finally, we have corner starters, and we know corners are the most common starters and the most dangerous to meet on average. First thing that pops out is far sides do terribly. So this is like meeting a starter from 1 in 6 or 8. I think, though, this is a similar problem to the bailout issue before. I think these are most often played when people see nothing else that appeals, not when, that looks like a good move. Because often if it looks good, something else will look better and the person won't play it. And they'll often only play these moves when they're kind of trying to obfuscate a position that looks difficult. And so I think this move scores clearly the worst, but part of that is the bailout effect. Part of that is these aren't really being played as a go-to option. When they are played, it's a panic option. Other options look kind of similar. Playing next to without capturing is scoring only slightly under 50%. Playing next to and capturing is also scoring just a tiny bit under 50%. Playing as a center reply is scoring a little more under 50%, but actually it was putting up a plus at one point and then went on a loss streak very recently. Going in adjacent corners, a bit more under 50%, but not that much more. And something interesting about adjacent corners is they are having a much higher decisive rate, right? You'll notice both the win and loss numbers are pretty close to the tie numbers, and the tie numbers are, for instance, for capturing, the tie number is almost equal to wins plus losses combined for first turn, or for second turn. So actually, adjacent corners look like a way that is more likely to lead to decisive results. Similar for opposite corners, which is both quite likely to lead to decisive results either way, and is scoring pretty close to 50%. All in all, basically every option here looks good except for the far side. And by good, I mean like you'll put up a slight minus, but one's not necessarily more minus than another. Something I would caution is I think centers cannot be done as reliably as other moves. We do see it being played a lot. It is the most common single square to meet a starting corner in. But it kind of either works or it doesn't. Like, it either sets you up to have captures and have synergies, or it doesn't. And when it does, it's a very appealing square to play in, and that's why it's played in a bunch. But if someone tried to play it every game, I think it would have more trouble than any other type. On the other hand, if you play it, 25% of your games, that might be the best 25%, because when it's good, it's often really, really good. But for the most part against corners, pretty much everything looks viable. And I'm even skeptical of this far side numbers. I think far sides are clearly better than this looks. And so, yeah, I think that's all the stats I have. I used to like adjacent corners the most. Recently, I've been enjoying opposite corners. I also quite like capturing and playing next to corner starters. I think there's lots of tools to do, and whichever you like within it can be viable if you understand the kind of resulting setups. I think sides pretty clearly meeting it with corners is going to be has a very good chance to be the better replies. And against center starters, it does look like corners outperform sides, but both perform well, so it's hard to take too strong a takeaway from that. Probably the main takeaway is you shouldn't be starting with center starters very often, or if you do, you should have a better plan than people who've employed it have. I've made a video about the center attack. I think it's actually an appealing way to play, but of course, it does. The evidence we have is not looking great for center starters. Sides are played about a third of as often as corners and still score worse. I think side starters are overplayed. And I think, especially if you're playing side starters more than kind of a quarter of the time, this is probably not an optimal distribution. I would guess the correct distribution is something like, no idea if this is true, say 75% corners. Let's go 80% corners, 15% sides, 5% centers. Wild guesses, no justification, but that's currently what my brain says. And yeah, so hopefully this was interesting. The other big takeaway is first turn is a much bigger advantage in closed than it is open. There are a lot more ties in open than there are closed. But interestingly, even though there's more decisive games in closed, closed wins less on second turn than they do in open. And so even though there's more wins overall by a clear amount in closed, they're all going to first turn. And yeah.